episode 49 of the Tomato Timer, and joining me today is my mentor and the founder of Stasher and Treepoints, Jacob, who is recognized as a Forbes 30 under 30, and he runs the Morality of Everything's podcast, an everyday philosophy show which ranks in the top 5% in the world rankings. That's incredible. Thank you so much for joining us, Jacob.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Zeus.
So I want to start off with kind of your entrepreneurial journey, and you took Stasher from an idea to a company which is valued at $12 million. It's VC backed. So you're kind of the typical student to entrepreneur kind of story, right? But tell me a little bit more about that story. How did it come up? How did it come about?
Sure. I should quickly say Stasher, for anyone who's not familiar with it, is a luggage storage platform. So basically, think Airbnb. Instead of looking where you're going to stay, it's about where you can store your stuff. Actually, it's super useful for when you stay in Airbnbs. That was kind of part of the inspiration. Is you check out, you need somewhere to keep your things. Keen travelers among you will probably be familiar with the problem. And the story starts back, as you say, when we were students, and we just moved down to London. I was doing my master's year, and my co-founder got a job in digital marketing, and we talked a lot before then about wanting to become entrepreneurs. It was around the time when Airbnb and Uber and similar platforms were starting to become household names. You know, they were starting to get really popular. Partly, I think that was just the sharing economy wave was beginning to take off, and I guess there's something about platform dynamics as well that's quite exciting. So we were looking at those businesses and we were thinking, oh man, it'd be so cool if we could pull off something like that. But we didn't have any concrete ideas until when we moved to London. We found that people were always asking Ant if they could leave stuff at his place. So he used to live really centrally between King's Cross and Euston, and anyone familiar with the city will know that they are two of the busiest stations. So people were asking him if they could leave stuff there all the time. And one time he just joked, he was like, I should be charging people for this. And we were like, hang on a second. And there was this real light bulb moment. And that part's completely true. We're like, okay. And we got all excited, and we basically went ahead and prototyped this website where people could book storage. And originally it was in my flat or Anthony's flat. And that in itself was useful because it meant that all our early customers came literally to our doorstep, and we'd be interviewing them and asking them how they found us and why they needed us. And over time, the model has evolved. So we no longer do individual people's homes as hosts. We mainly use shops and hotels because they have regular opening hours and CCTV security features, and they like the ancillary income stream. So yeah, you learn and you grow, but that was where it came from.
That's so cool. It's like a really proper Eureka moment, and it actually kind of came together. So obviously, this, like, you guys were already thinking about it, but was the entrepreneurial pathway the thing you always wanted to do? And in particular, so your story is, it has all these kind of accolades and achievements, but is it always a glamorous journey? What are the things which people don't talk about?
Yeah, obviously, from all our conversations, that's it's absolutely not glamorous all the way at all. And I mean, to be honest, the first year, it's funny looking back. I remember the first year when we were doing this, we had so many people just being like, oh, is it safe? I don't know if I'd feel comfortable using this. And possibly worse for the people who sort of, I don't know that they meant to be patronizing, but they'd ask things like, oh, how's the business project going? And, you don't get taken seriously as sort of having a real business. And I remember the point that changed was the point where we raised our first round of money, because we, that happened at the end of our first year. We were doing it part-time alongside like my studies and Ant's job. But when we got to the summer of 2016, we were getting bookings every day. It was starting to get quite exciting. We wrote to the CEO of Big Yellow Storage, and at the time we were just sort of asking for like advice and with an angle to raising money, and he loved it, and he did come on board as our first investor. And I remember definitively that was the point where people suddenly started taking it more seriously, and they stopped saying how's the project and started saying how's the business. And so that was pretty cool. It meant that we could go full time on it, so it started being a side hustle in the same way and started being our main focus. Did I always know that I wanted to be? Did I know that I wanted to work in luggage storage? Absolutely not. Be an entrepreneur? I think so. I think I've always loved the idea. I think partly it's that sense of like autonomy and getting to work for yourself, and kind of. I think as a student, I was always quite motivated to learn stuff like, that I was curious about more so than what was set. Like, and I'm sure a lot of people on here would probably identify with that. Like, I guess you get sort of curriculum stuff that you have to do, but then sometimes the things you spend the most time on are the things that you're just curious about for the sake of it. You go down these sort of rabbit holes of like learning. And so I think I've always been sort of like that a little bit anyway. And so I guess, but I think my honest answer would have been, I don't know that I would have bet on me becoming an entrepreneur as a student, because I always figured that it was something where you kind of had to get lucky and get the right idea, and you can't bank on that being the case. And I guess, to a large extent, we were quite lucky with this because it was the right idea at the right time, and timing is a big factor.
Absolutely, timing is. There's so many things which could have become like the next big thing, just because they weren't there at the right moment, at the right time. It just didn't happen. You mentioned raising your first round, and you mentioned going and talking to some of the these big players right at the start. So this is kind of like a question which is independent of just entrepreneurship. But you've obviously had to, you run your own podcast, you go around, you've pitched, I know you've pitched at the Palace, you've done all these kind of things. So these kind of events are essentially convincing people, right? They're like massive. There was a book on my dad's shelf, I still remember, it's like, how do you speak so that others listen, or something like some cheesy text like that. But it is true, right? How do you say something, or how do you describe or tell a story that other people's want to listen, and they're not just being being polite or anything like that? So what are the things you've learned along the way to convince people, whether it's investors or team members or anyone along that spectrum?
It's a really good question. And we were just talking about this before the show started. So I've been giving it some thought. There's a few elements to it. I should say, I don't think this is a skill that I had before I went into entrepreneurship. I don't think it's something that I'm sure some people are born quite persuasive, but I don't think that I was. I think it's something I've had to learn on the job through the process of, like in the early days of Stasher, a lot of it was door-to-door sales. We'd go around shops and hotels and meet with the managers in person and try and sign them up. And often it was cold sales as well. So it wouldn't even be appointments. We'd literally just go into these shops and be like, have you ever thought about storing luggage in your back room? And, there's nothing like getting rejected thousands of times to like boost your confidence in this matter. I think it depends a bit on the context, and every context, you gave a few examples there, and they're all slightly different. So pitching at competitions, pitching to investors, or like pitching for sales, or hiring people, team, they all have slightly different needs. But I think that's the first thing to say, is it's about recognizing the needs of your audience and making sure what you're saying is relevant to that. You use the word storytelling. I think that's key. I think the second big thing is about, if you want to be convincing, you want to sort of create the story, the sort of narrative structure. People are very sort of narrative minded in the way they look at the world. We have a sort of narrative lens. And so if you can kind of present this journey and then show people where they fit into it, they really identify quite strongly with your proposition. So, simple example, in the case of trying to sign up a host, you explain the proposition, you explain the need. If you can link their needs to what you're doing, you say, you're looking for a way to break ancillary revenue. We've got a really simple product. This is the journey that we're on, and this is where you fit into it. You start to create this quite persuasive narrative that people can buy into. That's, I think, more tellingly the case with pitches and with VCs, because that's quite a clear-cut conversation. You're basically like, I've got this idea, I want to grow it. VCs, I think, they'll talk about the ways that they're different, but in general, what they're really looking for is, one, to make a good return on their money, but two, to have something they can kind of boast about in their clubs or whatever. Something they can feel proud of. They're I invested in this great travel tech company or this great climate tech company, and something they feel excited to be a part of. And again, that comes back to that storytelling element. I guess other elements around talking convincingly come down to the confidence with which you present yourself, good balance of sort of tone and pace and all these things. But those are smaller details. I think if you've got the right sort of needs and storytelling aspects met, I think then it does start to tie together. Just be confident as well.
Of course. I talk a lot about or try to convince younger kind of generations to be more sensitive to this art of storytelling. We similarly to you, I wasn't able to do any of this. I wasn't able to present. I was a very shy kid. I couldn't go and shake other people's hands in the beginning. So it's been a big kind of jump for me as well. And I always tell them, the importance, not just for an entrepreneur, not just for someone who's working in a job, in every case, as a human being, as someone who lives in a social society, right? We need to be convincing and speaking and sharing our insights and actually bringing people along. We are, at the end of the day, a part of a community in every case we are living. So it's such an important skill, and it's something that's, as with all the important skills, not taught at school as well.
Yeah, classic.
So maybe like they kind of reinforce my ideas, or tell me a little bit, to convince me why it's important for students, specifically whether it's at uni or even at school. Why should they be kind of thinking about these skills as important in their life?
I suppose even if you don't see yourself as a natural salesman or wanting to go in a sales facing role, sales is, like you say, it's a part of life beyond just business. If you think about the process of getting a job, you have to sell yourself, you have to sell your skills. If you think about the process of going on dates, that's a bit more specific context, but you are kind of selling yourself as a person to start a relationship with or whatever. It's you want to be able to sort of present yourself confidently in all walks of life. And I think, if you're at school, I suppose you're thinking about university applications, but even, it doesn't really matter what sort of specific context it is. It's just about like the confidence it gives you in presenting yourself. And then it's so useful, right? Like you talk about sort of being able to take people on journeys and persuade them and kind of tie them to your story. It's just a fantastically useful life skill beyond the sort of obvious business context of being able to sell things.
Now, I want to talk about the kind of the now, what you've been working on the past few months, I think. So obviously, COVID hasn't been very friendly to a travel tech company.
It has not.
Over this past few months of knowing you, even, I know our first mentorship call started off with you telling me about this idea or this kind of prototype that you'd been developing. And now you launched Treepoints, a kind of an application which is fighting climate change, essentially. So I am in awe of you to see that, you took a hit. It must have been tough. Lots of your workers had to be furloughed and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, you were able to take, not only were you able to pivot, but you were able to start something new and bring it to where it has. So tell me a little bit about Treepoints. And also tell me about kind of where does that kind of motivation and energy and that kind of mental stability or emotional stability come from to kind of keep going, especially in moments of direness,
Sure. I'll sort of walk you through the last year. I guess that's probably the easiest way to answer the question. COVID. I mean, I'm not unique. COVID's been a weird year for everyone. I think. In some ways, this is perhaps my like innate optimism shining through in the worst of cases. Like in some ways, the fact that it was so bad for Stasher was almost a good thing, right? Because I remember talking to an advisor in the run up to COVID, like in sort of February, March time, before things had really been announced, we were like, this is going to be really bad news. Like as soon as we saw it come to Europe, we were like, okay, we're in trouble here. And we were like, all right, cash flow, sort of do all the forecasting, all the sensible stuff. Like I got out ahead of it with our investors. I was like, we've got all these contingency plans in place. As it happens, like my worst case contingency plans were like nowhere near the scale of what happened. But obviously I could never have predicted the government support would have been as good as it was and everything else that kind of went with that. So once that sort of storm had kind of blown over, there was a period in which we're like, can we pivot things with Stasher? Can we reutilize the assets? And I think the fact that, we were hit on both sides. So like our supply of storage, the hotels and the shops, they all had to close because of regulations. Our demand was tourists and no one was traveling. So we were like, we've kind of got just a website, we've been reduced to just a platform, but like, there's not a lot we can do here. And I think I saw tons of other companies kind of like flailing to pivot, and some did well and some didn't. And they were trying to repurpose our resources. And in the end, we were like, in some ways, this is a weird advantage. It's just the clearest thing for us to do is hibernate, because we can't really make something work out of nothing here. I'm talking back in April. So we basically just like put Stasher in hibernation, saved the money, tried to keep sort of things as upbeat and positive with the team as possible. Like we didn't let anyone go. It was just a case of the furlough scheme running out. But Yeah, so we ended up with this nice situation where we had a few months off, really, which is really rare as entrepreneurs, especially because last year we raised a round of money, and I've been working sort of insanely long to make that happen. And then 2020 was the big year, and we just started our international expansion plans, and then it kind of got paused. And I was in this weird position where we're like, okay, have some time off. So we did that, and that was in its own way quite nice, quite refreshing. It was a weird time, obviously, for everyone. It was lockdown, so it wasn't like we could really do all that much with time off, but it was a good chance to sort of do some upskilling and tons of exercise and whatever, just kind of keep healthy, keep as happy as possible. We started the podcast around that period just because we're like, well, we've got this time and we'd be having these debates anyway. So let's basically record them and broadcast them. And you mentioned that in the intro. Thanks for that. It's basically, it's just a podcast. It's an everyday philosophy podcast where we'll take controversially, not even necessarily controversial, but interesting questions like, is it wrong to listen to the music of problematic artists was last week. The one coming out this week is it morally wrong to keep pets? Which is actually something I hadn't thought of until Ant asked me, and then we recorded it. So that was quite fun. And then things started to pick up in the summer. So that was looking all right for Stasher. And then the second wave reared its head. And we was like, okay, the first break was fine. It was all right to take some time off. But just as, I guess, it's kind of the entrepreneurial mindset, right? Like we were just like, we're not happy to just sort of sit still for 6 months on furlough and do nothing, there's not enough that we can do on Stasher because of the sort of particular circumstances. And we basically this was different. It's a very different experience to founding Stasher, because Stasher came about because we were keen to do something, and the idea kind of hit us. And Treepoints was like, we've got this free time and we don't want to be stuck indoors without anything to focus on. What can we possibly do? And we literally went to the whiteboard and we're like, what problems do we care about? What could we do about them? And we had climate change and financial inequity as the two final candidates of how can we do something on this. We had this vague idea of tying them together into a green investment platform. And then we worked backwards from that to an MVP, because we were it's obviously there's financial regulation, etc., that would go into being able to qualify for that. But what we could do is make a simple subscription platform for people to live carbon neutral. So to support offsetting, tree planting, bottle recycling, all these kind of other good green activities. Yeah. And it sort of evolved into this quite nice concept of we sort of think of it as the app for managing the green side of your life. And it's not really targeted at super eco sort of warrior type people either. It's more for your average person, kind of like me and Ant, who cared about climate change, but we don't sort of make a point of we don't eat vegan, for example. And this is all stuff that we're finding out now because we had the time to research it. And so we started with that. The Treepoints project has sort of evolved to encompass businesses, and we've built this API that means businesses can easily embed offsetting or tree planting. So in due course, in more and more shops, you'll see make this order carbon neutral, and ticking that will basically trigger an offset through Treepoints, which is quite a nice little project on its own. So yeah, that's where we've got to now. It's actually been brilliant. I think it's been a real positive for my own mental health and everything else to have this project to just fully devote myself to, because otherwise I'd really miss having that same focus that Stasher would otherwise have brought me. We keep Stasher ticking along, but like we say, while that's on furlough, it's actually been a great thing to be able to focus the team on an entirely new project instead. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I might have used the wrong words in the question. It wasn't a pivot. It was almost like a hibernation and a start of a completely new idea.
Yeah. Because strictly it's its own separate thing. And in due course, we're looking to possibly raise some money for Treepoints too, because I think it's become such a hot space, if you'll pardon the pun. The climate tech area is just getting really, really exciting. And we've talked to a few investors already who are just they're so keen on the space and sort of how we can do more.
So actually, my next question was on that itself, climate tech, this intersection of fighting climate change through entrepreneurship and technological solutions. What's it like? You've been in it for a few months now. And why is it important to do it in this way versus, because we climate change isn't new. It's been being fought by large organizations and NGOs for many, many years now. But why is it so exciting to do it now and then using kind of startups as the vehicle to solve it?
It's an excellent question. I think In some ways, the pandemic has highlighted one really key thing about the nature of the world we live in, and that's a sense of like how connected we are. And like this one problem in the case of the pandemic itself has just like swept the entire globe. And it's quite a telling example of, as I say, like how connected we are as a sort of global society. And it's almost a bit of a foreshadowing of like how devastating climate change will be if we kind of allow it to run rampant across the world as a whole. So I do think as soon as the pandemic subsides, climate change will, rightly so, become the like dominant issue that's sort of center stage in the media, or the dominant crisis, if you like, that's facing our world. And then as to sort of climate tech as an industry, it's a really interesting space. And I think one thing we're all figuring out as sort of climate entrepreneurs, I mean, something we did really early on was we were like, if we're going to set something up like this, it can't be a for-profit enterprise in the same way. So we made it a social enterprise, and we basically said, like, legally in the articles, the focus is impact, not profit. And any investors that subscribe will, again, they'll be sort of tied into that. It's impact, not profit. So it's something about the fact that it's like a sort of problem the way that it is, just it wouldn't feel right to sort of fight it with sort of profits in the same way. That being said, I do think there's a lot of benefit to using private enterprise, and obviously we're a private business, we're not an NGO or a registered charity, because I think it allows you to, for one, raise investment and be quite nimble and market and kind of in many ways just employ the skills that we've picked up over the last sort of 5 or so years of running another business, right? Like these are skills that we've honed over the course of marketing a different service, but a lot of them are quite transferable. So we're using that now to tech expertise to build out a solution that's actually just like makes offsetting quite easy. And so I think it is important. I think the other thing that's important is just there's a lot of really bright and talented people out there who work on all sorts of startups. And I think getting more and more of them working on big problems like this is just a great use of people's time and energy. And it's fun. You meet some really good people as well. Some really interesting people out to tackle the problem.
Yeah, I was going to kind of mention this because like there's a morality to it, right? When you're fighting a crisis, like you have to do it in a socially and responsible way, essentially. And more, especially kind of the entrepreneurs that I've been surrounded by, almost always have their startup having some sort of social impact as part of their offering anyway. So it's really encouraging to see that. But I still find it challenging to kind of live in economics of the world where impact, there's impact isn't a, what's the NFT thing going around these days? It's not a non-fungible token, right? It's not.
Yeah, I've seen them going around.
Yeah. So is there a possibility where impact can become part of our kind of like economics, So if there's like cash flow projections, impact projections as well, because that's as important as whether a company is liquid or whatever.
Yeah, because you're a shining example of this, right? Like we've talked about this a few times in our previous calls with ZNotes, and just like it's primarily set up for impact, or that's always been your mission and agenda, and you've sort of had the challenge of like making the financial side support the impact that you want to have. And I think Treepoints is similar to that. I think, and I hope we're actually our generation and the generations that follow us are kind of growing up in an era where like capitalism is evolving, or is going to have to evolve to encompass some of the stuff you've just talked about. And I think, for us, we grew up like through the financial crisis, right? Like that was something we saw firsthand as like kids in school, and then like now sort of graduating university, just entered the job market, and we've had the pandemic. We've had a string of, there's 2 crises in a row that were both called once in a lifetime. And both in different ways kind of highlight the fragility of the capitalist system. And I don't mean that in a sort of post-capitalist idealistic way. I think capitalism is a very efficient way or it's the most efficient way that we know of allocating resources thus far. But I think the good thing about the pandemic has been around the way that governments have sort of rallied to provide support in ways that we've never seen before. And it's actually kind of pushed the envelope in terms of what we know is possible. And it makes you realize that, this is a year in which public health has kind of superseded all other concerns. And actually that shows to me that it's possible if we were to sort of prioritize environmental health or other aspects. Like,
Correct.
it's kind of the job of politics to balance all these aims. And for a long time, we did have like economic growth as kind of first and foremost, but actually it's ultimately the role of politics, even more so than economics, to kind of balance these different aims and create a world that supports that, because it's just about aligning incentives. And if we can align people and businesses' incentives to have a positive environmental impact, among other things, then I think we get way closer to building the kind of world that we want to inherit and want to be a part of running. So again, I'm not really optimistic, but I think we'll get there. I think enough people there that
entrepreneurs need to be eternally optimistic. Jacob, it's been amazing having you. We've kind of hit the Pomodoro just about now, but I'd like to kind of close with a few words from you of advice, essentially. Independent of entrepreneurship, because your journey has had a whole bunch of things, and to class it just under an entrepreneur's journey is I think, not fair. So how would you leave us with your words?
Okay. I don't want this to sound too cheesy, but essentially, one of the things that we've learned over time is you should never be afraid to reach out to people, and in particular, quite like high up people. We got very lucky with the big yellow storage thing, for example. We just cold emailed the CEO, and a couple of months later, he came on board as our first investor. That's the first in a series of examples of times where we've just like reached out to interesting or important people. It doesn't always come off, but I think there's you lose nothing by trying in a lot of these cases. Yeah. So my main thing would just be, one, don't be afraid to reach out, and two, don't be afraid to like take that step. With the podcast, we just put it live. We didn't have any sort of expectation or ambition for it to grow the way it did, and we got lucky because a couple of episodes went viral on Reddit. So, it's just one of those things. You just you do enough things and you get lucky, and things kind of snowball.
Amazing. Thanks so much for being here. It was awesome to have you.
Nice. Perfect timing, by the way. Look at that.